Welcome to another episode of Phrasally, Verbocious. Alan and I are thrilled this week to have two guests with us. We've got Ila Coimbra and James Taylor. Guys, perhaps you want to let us know a little bit about yourselves. James?
Yeah, lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting us. So I live in Brasilia, Brazil. I'm a teacher trainer, materials writer, and a fellow podcast producer. I've got a lot of irons in the fire. That's I won't list everything because we'll take up half the podcast. That's
me. Great stuff. And you're in Brasilia. Ila, where are you?
Well, thanks again for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. Ila Coimbra. I have been teaching English for quite a while, like 20 years. And as James, I'm also a course book writer and teacher trainer. And now I'm living in Munich, Germany, but I'm originally from Brazil. So, yeah. That's it. Pretty much about me in a short.
Thanks very much for joining us. We do really appreciate it.
It's quite an exciting international edition today. We're live from Madrid, Munich, Brasilia, and a small tiny village in Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
Yes, apparently. Quite international.
Yeah. Apparently. Okay, great. Well, I came across your project, I suppose, about a year ago when I was researching my master's. I was researching and writing about representation of gender and sexuality in ELT course materials. And one of my best friends, who actually teaches in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, sent me a WhatsApp saying, "Have you seen this book?" And I genuinely replied with, "Are you sure this is not an April Fool's joke?" It was around the second week of April, and I was thinking this can't be real. And then I went online and found it, and I paid my €5 and downloaded it, and was delighted. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what Raise Up is.
Yes, I can start, and then James,
go ahead.
You can complete, right? So the thing is, when we decided to write Raise Up, what we had in mind is to create a mainstream course book for English teaching that had a more accurate representation of the world that we live. And we have been teaching for a while, James and I, and we identified that many groups are underrepresented in the ELT material. So, for example, women, LGBT, QIA plus community, disabled people, indigenous people. Also, we have the elderly are not accurately represented, very stereotyped, and non-conventional body types, a series of topics that are not really, if are represented, they are misrepresented, very stereotyped. For example, disabled people always being an example of inspiration or showing what they can do despite. Right. So what we had in mind when we created Rise Up, it was exactly to have these groups a little bit better represented. This is what we had. James?
Yeah. So the approach we took basically was to create lessons which, in all ways, they feel and look like a very mainstream ELT lesson, So in terms of the methodology behind the lessons, and it's very typical. Right? We're deliberately not trying to sort of use a revolutionary new method or anything. That the whole point is to say, look, you can teach kind of regular, whatever that means, regular ELT lessons, which are inclusive. Because I think there's that tendency of when you're doing something like this, which is a bit revolutionary, then also you're going to kind of tear up the rule book and do different types of lessons and everything. We want to say, well, no, I mean, you can do that, of course, but we want to show how it's possible that in any kind of teaching context, in any kind of course book, even the most mainstream, you can have inclusive lessons. So the approach that we took generally was that our lessons are not sort of they're not what we call problematized lessons. We don't look at the big issues related to these different social groups, but we just prefer to sort of say, look, here's a regular lesson, and there happen to be these people here as the subject of these lessons.
So is that what
those approaches are valid, but we chose this one because we wanted to get that message across and say, look, you don't have to do a big lesson about issues to include people from these groups.
Okay, because that's what I was going to ask you, was in terms of teaching in inclusive ways, what that means for you. But I suppose that kind of answers that question, in that it's simply about including people. It doesn't have to be something big. Go ahead.
Well, two examples that we have from this approach that we took into inclusion is a lesson that we had on family, family relations and vocabulary about family. The only difference is that there is a lesbian couple in the family tree. That's the only difference. We don't problematize about LGBT or same-sex marriage. Another example is the unit about texting, that is about texting and internet language, and people who are texting are refugees, and that's it. This is how they are included. It's not problematizing or bringing up issues about them or debate or anything like that.
For sure. Actually, that's a nice moment, Alan, because you've used the families unit. Is that right?
Yeah, I think because you guys had mentioned it in IATEFL Voices, was it a couple of months ago, where the lesson, like you said, the lesson was the family tree and the vocabulary. It wasn't going, we're not making a scene of this certain, say, a same-sex couple or something. So, for example, a couple of weeks, it would have been about maybe this time last year, there was the family unit in a mainstream book that wasn't great quality, I found. So with my group of 10-year-olds, I used the Raise Up version instead. So we had the family tree, we had, it's split over 2 pages off the top of my head, isn't it? So there's my family, there's the family tree, and then there's the possessive S's. So we used that in the class, and it went the way you kind of wanted it to go, where it didn't bring attention to anything. It just flowed like the perfect, natural, this is a family, and that's fine.
And so family.
Yeah. And I think especially like doing stuff like that at a young age as well is, maybe if you did that at a higher level or with adults, maybe they might notice it more, but especially with kids, it's like, that's fair enough, and that was it. And they seemed to like it, and they thought, fine.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that often.
I'm really happy to hear that.
Yeah, very good feedback. Good, great, especially 10 years old. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, as part of my research, when I was looking into how teachers responded to what they had to work with, one of the comments that came up a couple of times was that actually even with older students, one of my respondents was telling me, but these things come up from my students naturally. And it's really odd then that I then present them with a textbook that has a page about relationships that only has straight couples, because I have gay students in my class, or what these other things might be. These students come into contact with these things anyway in their lives. So why are the book materials that we then use sort of excluding things that these students already know about? And what are the consequences of that, right?
What are the consequences of doing that? I mean, obviously it's regrettable in a number of ways in terms of we're not representing society, but I think we would say that there are actual sort of tangible effects of this. If you're denying recognizing some of the identities that your students have, then I think that can lead to problems. Don't you agree, Ila?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it affects directly motivation, for example, or ownership of language, because what we are telling the students is that English, for example, if we have gay students in our classroom, we are telling them that the English world is not their world. They don't belong to the English-speaking world, because all they see is heterosexual couples. So they don't see themselves represented in the English-speaking world. Why should they use that language then if they are not welcome, or they are not there? Maybe not being welcome, that's not the feeling, but they are not there, so it's not their language. How can they express their identity in that language they're learning if they're not there, right?
And it's even, I would say, more so than that, the actual language that we then teach. Because if we don't teach them words like, I mean, even as much as divorce, if the word divorce isn't in the family, I mean, we know that there are students who have divorced parents or separated or adoption or step. I mean, the amount of time it takes to explain step siblings and half siblings. And I've got a room full of people who have these situations at home. And it's like the books sort of have this imaginary family.
Ideal sanitized family.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So just to pick up on something that I think is coming out of this conversation as well, to turn it around a little bit, have you encountered issues or problems where people have you had any feedback where people have had problems using materials like these, like in Raise Up?
Well, something
so
I found
far
amazing.
I haven't had any.
No. So something I found pretty amazing actually is I haven't received any negative feedback at all. I mean, there's still time, but
plenty.
but I was expecting some kickback, presumably from it's usually angry white men to appear somewhere, but they haven't really manifested, and it's very interesting. I think it's interesting in two ways. One, because you expect stuff on the internet, but I find that very easy to dismiss because it's it's just someone on the internet, But what I found really interesting as well is that talking to people in the profession, speaking to, we've spoken to a lot of materials writers, we've spoken to editors, different teachers. Everyone I've spoken to is on board with this project. Everyone. And so that then begs a really interesting question for me is, why doesn't it happen then, right? Because no one seems to disagree. And yet, when you look at course books that are produced, everyone's like, yeah, it's a great idea, it's great. And then, where is it? I mean, I have my theories about this. I think it's to do with the people who are more on the business side of publishing than the pedagogical side. But I think it's really interesting that and we're very grateful. We've been really, really, the reaction's been much more than we could have anticipated. So in general, we're very happy. And as to actually on the specific lessons themselves, no, I mean, I think that maybe some lessons would be more appropriate with certain groups and so on, but and sometimes, like the one about refugees, could be a little bit challenging for some groups. But that's a teacher's job, right? To
that's what we do.
Yeah. Do you think then there might be like the publishers might be going, here, this is a success, so maybe the tide will change. So you might get like 5th edition of whatever, and they might go, we might take some of these ideas. Obviously not to plagiarize your ideas.
The thing is, I think what is we are open to offers, right?
Offers of employment are always welcome.
But what I think is behind it is there are two things, right? First, they are thinking about big markets, where some topics will not sell. That's it. Because they might be crime. For example, there are some countries where LGBT community is criminalized, so they're not going to buy course books. They're not going to sell their course books for that market. And I think that this is what they have in mind, which to me, it's a symptom of their view on education. Right, education is a product. So they're thinking about making money. They are companies, right?
Just picking up on that point, that in terms of publishers and the big markets and everything else, one of the things I noticed when I was doing my research was that some of the books are specifically marketed at certain sub-markets. So they do a different edition, especially for the Spanish-speaking market. So the corpus material taken out of the exams, Cambridge exams, for example, might be specific to Spanish speakers. If that section of the page can be changed, surely a photograph on the page can be changed as well.
Exactly, right? If you can adapt to other markets, you can adapt a lot of things, right?
Yeah, but I think realistically, that's an economic decision, right? That's a business decision.
Absolutely.
A lot of publishers are not going to make that. So, I mean, our friend Tyson Seaburn, who's also doing some really good work on this, he he has a fantastic talk called "This Talk Will Make You Gay," which he did at ITEFL last year, and his basic premise is the fact that we need to sort of forget about the big publishers because they're not going to do it, right? So we need to start making our own materials like we have done and like he's doing himself, and just go for it and just do what we think is right and forget about the major publishers. From my perspective, I partially agree with him. I understand that, but I still feel at the same time we need to put pressure on them to start trying to make inroads. But the thing we have to remember, of course, is that with any of these kind of changes, it's always very incremental, very slow. It's going to take a long time. So I think we have to be patient, but we have to keep chipping away.
Yeah, and this type of changes normally come from the base, not from the top, right? And so I think this is how we are doing our part to change that. Maybe we might not see that in our lives, but I think there is a change going on. And it might in 20, 30 years maybe change. We don't know, but I think James has a point there, and it has to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it has to come from us.
If you look at John, when we looked at one of our biggest influences behind this project was the writer John Gray, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Construction of English, where he analysed course books in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, looking at different aspects of how social groups were represented, and he shows that there was a huge improvement in both in terms of in representation of both women and people of different ethnicities, and so that change did happen from the 70s to the 90s. I think we would argue since the 90s the change has been very, very incremental and too slow. So it needs to pick up. So it has happened before. So it can happen again.
Yeah. Do you think with the push of the internet and more international conferences, getting the word out would make it easier now?
I believe so. IATEFL, for example, is for the last 2 editions of the IATEFL conference. This topic has been around in more than one talk, and last year we actually had a plenary on it. So I think this is something that we're starting to discuss in the big forums, right? Which means that there is change going on.
Yeah, something I would add though is that of course we're talking a lot about course books, which is important. Of course, they're hugely important, but there are other materials that teachers are also using. So the fact that teachers can download loads of materials off the internet, many of which are not very good, are quite poorly designed, means that there's also more access to more materials which are also represent people very poorly as well. So I think it kind of can go both ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just actually to ask on that, Ben, you're talking about this kind of change maybe coming from the base rather than from the top, and people poorly designing materials. What tips would you have, or what ideas would you have for people who would be interested in developing their own materials, or starting on that road that you two have come along?
I mean, the first thing I would say before I'll let Ella, can I let you in a second? But the first thing I want to say before
go on,
is the fact that, and I think it's a natural kind of part of a teacher's life cycle, is that when we start teaching, we use the materials that we're given almost like they're sacrosanct. Once we start to get a bit more confident, we start to sort of pick at them a bit and start to move things around and perhaps replace things and so on, which is a good thing. It shows the teacher is developing. But when you're designing materials, you do have to know how to design materials, right? It's not just an easy thing. And I often think with whatever type of materials, when teachers are developing them, they do need to really pay attention to materials design and lesson design, because it's very easy to sort of try and do the right thing, but then if you're creating a bad lesson, even if it's representative, it's still a bad lesson, right? So that's the first thing I would say is, do make sure that you're kind of really paying attention to how lesson design works, and you look at course books, even if you don't agree with certain aspects of them, look at how they design our lesson. Okay, Ila, what you do the next bit.
Yeah, I was going to mention the use of images, right? If it's as picking up a little bit on what James was saying, we tend to substitute things. That's how we start designing our own materials. So, I think substituting, for example, images for images that are much more representative of society or much represent society more accurately. That's a good way to start, I think. And maybe a less easy way to do it is also question your own biases, right? If you want to design your material, you need to think about what is your concept, what is your position in society, and aren't you passing that through your material? Maybe you should have, I don't know, a more broadened snapshot of society, broader than your own. So, but I would definitely say that images are very powerful for inclusion and diversity.
Yeah. So I think another important point is to tread carefully, okay? Because this is an overall point that I think is really important that I want to make about this is the fact that when you're thinking about diversity and representation, it's very easy to think about you. Especially if you belong to one of the groups that you feel is not particularly well represented, is that's very much going to be your focus, right? But I think what we really want to encourage is that anyone who's creating any kind of materials or lesson plans or anything, whatever context, try and think about the people who aren't like you as well as the people who are like you, right? So of course you're going to think about people like yourself, and that's great. You should do that, but also try and think about the other groups as well in society who are not represented. So that I think that's really crucial. And then when you're doing that, tread carefully, okay? Because it's very easy to sort of kind of blunder into an area that you don't know very much about. It's not your lived experience. And you can kind of create a situation in the classroom that perhaps, you want to... The obvious thing to do with these kind of topics is to have a debate, right? But then are you giving a space for people to express views which are just frankly not acceptable anymore? Because people do have those views. Yeah. And so we're quite clear, I think, when we talk about this, we say, look, we're not here to give everyone the opportunity to express whatever view they have. Certain views are just not acceptable. So it's not, you have to be very, very careful about how you address these issues. And of course, the easiest thing to do is speak to someone, if you know someone from one of these groups, and say, what do you think about this lesson? Yes. That's the best thing to do. But just be very mindful of that as you're creating your lessons.
Yeah, I think that's something that works with sorry, I just want to say this, Ila, that that's why I think your approach in Raise Up of here's a normal lesson that happens to be about is a useful approach, because it removes that opportunity for things to derail and go off in a direction that you were trying to avoid, in fact, by bringing it into your classroom. Like, as you say, the obvious thing is to have a debate, but actually debating whether or not somebody has the right to exist isn't really a debate that I want to have in my classroom. And so that doesn't mean I can't bring representations of different groups there, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, Eli, you were going to speak.
No, it's just going to add to what James was saying about being careful. We also need to pay attention on how we are including. Because, for example, if you think about refugees, the way we included refugees in Rise Up was in a very light way, but there might be a tendency of exploiting the situation, the pain of a whole group for the sake of a grammar point. So we need to be very careful about not using a whole group's painful moment just for the sake of teaching, present perfect. Yeah. So, as James said, talk to a person. If you want to represent a certain group in your lesson, try to talk to a person from that group to see if you're not, doing things that are as offensive as the things that they live in society already.
Yeah,
to make sure, for example, say when you guys were writing Raise Up, then to make sure you got it right and you weren't, did it go through like multiple writing processes then? What was the process behind, make it like, for example, the family tree? What was the process behind making it subtle but yet effective, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I mean, this is
it
an approach
does.
we came up with that we sort of decided in advance. This is okay. This is going to be our approach, which is going to be, sort of inclusive but not problematized. And so we basically designed those lessons with that in mind. It would have been nice to have had a more thorough editing process but we're self-published. It's just the two of us at that stage. So, I mean, we didn't really have the resources to do much more than that, but we're both, materials writers. So, and we did, one thing we did do is that I sent some of the lessons to my TEFL commute colleague, Lindsay Clanfield, who's a very experienced writer, obviously. And I just asked him to take a look for us just to make sure we weren't screwing up massively. But that was more from a sort of a lesson point of view. Are these good lessons rather than representation? Ila has done a lot of work over the years on this subject with the Voices Special Interest Group in Brazil. So she was my sort of guide to make sure we weren't screwing up on this.
Yeah. And of course, I have my guides, right? For that family tree, one of my best friend is lesbian, so I asked her if is that offensive somehow. I mean, I showed her the lesson. Also, I'm writing. We are working on other lessons to be published, and I wrote one that includes a blind person. So I sent that lesson to a person who works with blind people and who is blind also. So she could give me some feedback. Okay, this is fine. You should make sure you mention this, this, and that because there's a big issue for us. So we have a good support group around us to help us.
But I think there's there's a wider issue there, though, which is the fact that when it comes to, if we're going back to talking about, the published course books, there are many different identities that we've covered that we look at in Raise Up, and there is no way that you can have a course book written by all of those groups in society. It's necessary that there are going to have to be people writing lessons about people who are not like themselves. Right? There's no way around that. Just out of practicality. So I think that for me the most important point is that we are conscious and that we develop those skills as writers to be able to do that. Because I just don't think it's not necessarily feasible that we can speak to a refugee and say, "Can you check this lesson for me?" It may, in an ideal world, we would, but it may not be. It may not be possible. And if that's the case, then then you need to be aware of how lessons are made. As I said, you need to look at the examples of how other people have done it, and really pay attention to those things. Because
and I suppose
that's the reality.
I suppose also in that ideal world, we'd be making space actually for people to be contributing lessons about from which they do have experience, right? So
yes, which is actually something that
I am pie in the sky sort of thinking there in that sense. But rather than I take your point, it would be infeasible to have in these major textbooks lessons written by all the people who are represented. But actually, that would be a great aspiration. Rather than writing for people's experience, letting them write from experience.
But I do think
this is kind of what we are doing, right?
Go on. I think that would be great, but it's never going to happen. So I think what's a more realistic aim and objective is to try and encourage everyone who writes materials to think about who they represent, who aren't like themselves.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what we want everyone to be doing, and then of course we want that group of people to be much more diverse than it is currently. So that would just automatically benefit everybody if that was the case. And I think there's no question that the course book writing, materials writing in general, is nowhere near diverse enough. And then the second aspect is, well, that's precisely what we're doing with Raise Up in the future. Is our aim is to have that approach more. We can tell you a bit about that if you want to know.
My next question is
what's happening next?
Where we are going.
That is literally my next question.
Written on our next point.
So take it away. Who's starting this one off? What's next, Eli? James?
Well,
go on, James. Go on.
Well, basically, what we're doing now. So we published the first book last year, and we're now planning to. Well, we are not planning. It's going to happen. We have we're going to do books by level, because the first edition of Raise Up was 8 individual lessons, which are of different levels that are aimed at supporting. They're supplementary materials for teachers. So like you used with your class, you used the family tree one. You can take that lesson and drop it in for that level. Our plan in the future is we're still not creating like an entire course book of the whole course. It's still going to be supplementary, but we're going to do books by level. So we're going to be publishing a B1 book in the next couple of months, and then after that the B2 book, and then next year we'll do the A levels, and then after that the C levels. So the plan, and then the other change as well is that the books are not going to be only written by me and Ilah, and so we're going to have we've invited a lot of people to write lessons for us from different groups. So we've got in the B1 book, Ilah's written 4 of the lessons, and then we've got 4 other writers who are contributing lessons, including Hugh Deller, which is very exciting because obviously he's a very famous writer, and then but we're basically looking for experienced writers like Hugh, like Andrew Walkley, who we've got as well in the B2 book. But then we also want people who have no experience, but who are passionate and wanting to write probably about their own group in society. And then we can help them, guide them through the writing process. So I'm at the moment more of an editor than I am as a writer now of the books. So we're changing the approach, because obviously the whole project is about inclusivity. So therefore we want to make the writing process of the books inclusive as well. Yeah, that's the concept.
Yeah, true.
That sounds pretty exciting, I have to say.
We are. we are very excited about it too.
Yeah, and fantastic. It's great because now obviously we're working with lots of people from around the world who are writing different lessons on different areas, and so it's very refreshing, for us to see what people are coming up with, their ideas for what they want the lesson to be about, and it's really it's really invigorating, and to work with people like someone like Hugh, or we have a sort of senior editor now for the first book, Luis Otávio Barros, who's a very, very popular writer here in Brazil, very experienced. To work with people like that is obviously amazing, but then also getting the opportunity to work with people who've never written for a course book before and have told us that they want to do that. It's really rewarding as well. So it's kind of rewarding in all directions. Yeah.
Is it still going down the self-published route, or do you go to a publisher with the next one then?
It's still self-published.
Okay.
Self-published, yeah. We'll follow the same route. And some we should mention as well, we haven't mentioned, of course, is the whole thing is for charity. It's all the money.
True.
Which is fantastic.
That we get goes to charity. So for the first book, that was for a cause in Sao Paulo. Maybe Ilah can tell you about that. She knows it better than me.
It's actually a shelter in Sao Paulo that a shelter for LGBT members who are kicked out from home because of their either gender identity or for their sexuality. And then they can stay in the shelter up to a year and a half. And during this year and a half, they receive lessons of everything that you can imagine, from sewing, makeup, language lessons. And it started as and inside this shelter there is a project called English to Transform, which started with the focus of the transgender community, teaching English to the transgender community in Brazil, which is still pretty much in prostitution. So having a second language, especially English, for this population means a lot of empowerment, repositioning in society. And that project was incorporated in this shelter. So this is where the money is going to help this shelter to go on.
So far, we raised over $700 for them. So we really
that's fantastic. Nice, well done.
It's fantastic.
It is. Yeah. And it's a fantastic project. If you're in São Paulo, definitely should visit them.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, James and Ilah. Obrigado. It's been genuinely fascinating and interesting to talk to you. I'm very excited about where your project is going in the future. If you after we go off air, you can tell us what to put up, and we'll put contact information in the show notes so people can contact you if they want to.
And more importantly, buy the book online.
Yeah, please.
Buy the book. Yes. So,
buy the book online.
Let me say this. If you go to Tailor Made English, which is TAY tailormadeenglish.com/raise up. That's the link to find the book. So yeah, or you can search for Raise Up Raise Up in ELT, and that will find us on all the social media places.
Yeah.
Nice one. And I can highly recommend it from personal experience in the classroom.
Thank you. That's amazing. That's great. Good to hear.
Thank you for your time, and thank you to our listeners for listening. Thank you for listening to another episode of Phrasally Verbocious. If you'd like to get in touch, you can tweet us
at PhrasallyV on Twitter.
You can email us
phrasallyverbocious@gmail.com.
You can check out our show notes online at
phrasallyverbociouspodcast.blogspot.com.
And please like, review, and comment us on your podcast subscription service of choice. Goodbye.
Goodbye.